The story of a long desert journey and the search for survivors of the almost vanished and forgotten first people of Africa, the Bushmen. And although the journey was only made last year, and the search to which I've referred far back in my childhood, you see, I was born of an old South African pioneering family. I am of Dutch origin, and my people have been in Africa for over 300 years. In fact, my great-grandfather led the first trek out of the Cape of Good Hope into the interior. And my grandmother, her sister, and a wonderful Cape-colored servant they had were the only survivors of that journey. Oddly enough, in the trek following on behind, which rescued the children, came my grandfather, a young boy then. And he married my grandmother 18 years later. That is nearly 110 years ago. And soon after they married, they went to settle in one of the frontier districts of southern Africa. It was very, very wild country then. And significantly enough, my grandfather's farm, as he called it then, was named Bushmansfontein, which means Bushman Springs. I'm afraid you won't believe how wild the country was in my grandfather's day when you see the farm as it is now. I saw it only a few weeks ago, and it looked like this. It's just today an ordinary sort of South African farm, but in my grandfather's day, I assure you, it was wild, wild country, and in the heart of the ancient Bushman territory of southern Africa. Moreover, the Bushman hadn't gone. The Bushman had only fled to the hills. He'd been driven out of the plains, but he was still in the hills. And rankling with injustice at what had been done to him, he came down from the hills whenever he could, whenever the backs of the invaders were turned, and he raided their farms and their homesteads. And of course they resented it very much. There was one thing that neither the black nor the white could forgive the Bushman, and that was that he had no sense of property, particularly not of theirs. And the result was that the invaders, particularly the white invaders, like my grandfather, organized themselves from time to time and went out to punish the Bushmen. You could almost see themselves saying to one another, "It's a lovely day today. Let us go out and shoot some Bushmen." Now that may sound very harsh, but if you read the history of what happened to the Bushmen, you'll come to very much that conclusion. And although my grandfather was a very religious man and was very upright and very honorable, and I loved him very much, but he had the same unforgiving attitude to the Bushmen. In fact, he organized the raid which killed off the last of the Bushmen in the southern Free State. I say killed off, but strictly that's not true. Because after the raid, when my grandfather was coming back from the cave in which the Bushmen had made their last stand, he heard some whimpering among the rocks. He went towards the sound, and there he found two little Bushman boys hiding. And it was more than even his stern old frontier heart could stand. And he took these two little boys up, he put them on front of his saddle, and he took them back to Bushman Springs, the place which had once belonged to the forefathers of these little Bushmen. And in my grandfather's home, these two little Bushman boys grew up as privileged members of the household. I remember them well, but when the time I was born, coming as I did at the tail end of a large Afrikaans family, they were already little old men. But you couldn't have had two more attractive companions. In fact, for a long period, long in my childhood time, they were my nurses. They looked after me. They went with me everywhere. And I remember they seemed to be as frightened of the dark as I was. And from them I learned something of their language. I learned to count up to 10 and nearly went purple in the process. I learned to say good day, and I learned to say good night in Bushman. That lovely good night of the Bushmen. And I went with them everywhere. They taught me what sort of food they gathered from the veldt. They taught me how to live if an emergency came, like themselves, entirely off the veldt. And they told me more. They told me the story, they told me the legends, and they told me the history as they knew it of their people. And in the process, I became so identified with them. I became to love them and their people so much that I felt that this extermination of their kind, I felt that this thing that my people and the black men had done to the Bushmen was so horrible that it might almost have been done to my own people. And ultimately, when these two little men died, I was heartbroken. And they died in a characteristic Bushman way. One little old man died of pneumonia, and the other died of a broken heart 10 days later, because he couldn't bear it to be alone. And when they were dead, I remember lying awake at night and feeling utterly, utterly miserable, because I thought that now there were no more Bushmen left in the world. I thought that now all these places, which once knew them so well, would know them no more. And I went on feeling that, and feeling utterly miserable, and feeling more and more ashamed of what we had done to the Bushmen, particularly when I started learning our history at school. And this went on for years, until one day an old hunter came into my father's home. We were still very much a frontier community, and all the great frontier characters used to call in at our house from time to time. And one day a very tall, tanned, lean, rugged sort of man walked in and said he'd come from a place I'd never heard of before, the Kalahari desert. And I remember my ears standing on end when suddenly I heard him say, "Do you know, I've just been in the Kalahari desert, and I've seen wild, wild Bushmen living there as they used to live in this part of the world." I remember going to my room, a wild surge of excitement and hope in me. I remember writing in the diary I'd just begun to keep in schoolboy Dutch. I wrote, and the day, I can see it so clearly, is the 13th of October, 1914. I wrote, "I have today decided that when I'm grown up, I'm going into the Kalahari desert and seek out the Bushmen and beg their pardon for what we have done to them." Now, what precisely had we done to them? Please come and look at this map with me. Now, 40,000 years ago, the whole of this area you see here, right from the Mediterranean down to the Cape of Good Hope, was inhabited by a man we all think was the ancestor of the Bushmen, a man called Paleolithic man, a caveman, a hunter. And 30 or 40,000 years ago, he was driven by an invasion from the east out of that area there into North Africa. And then in North Africa, he was driven down south of the Sahara, south of Egypt, into this part of Africa below the equator. But in this part of Africa, he maintained himself for about 30,000 years. He had the security and the isolation there to produce a culture of his own. This area here, was his favorite country. Here, at the southern tip of Africa, where the Antarctic swell breaks on the beaches of the Cape of Good Hope, the earliest sailors found the Bushmen combing the surf for food. Among these mountains and these fertile valleys, he had his home. Here, among these mountain tops, from these hillsides, he saw the white sails of the invaders come over the sea. In fact, remnants of the game he hunted have survived. The gnu, or wildebeest, as we call him, is still there. The blesbuck, called so because he has a white blaze in his forehead, is still running on the same slopes. The zebra and its young are still to be seen moving across the grassy meadows of Table Mountain and sheltering in its woods against the weather, as I saw them there a few weeks ago. They've survived because they've been protected by law. They're behind barbed wire. But the Bushman had no such protection, and you look for him in vain. Note, too, that among these animals there is one of the greatest buck of all Africa, the eland. He's not only the greatest in size, but he's the one who, above all the other animals, dominated the imagination of the Bushman. He's everywhere in Bushman painting. He's present in the Bushman stories and legends. But all these animals you see here, apart from the eland, the gnu, the zebra, and the blesbuck, were for thousands of years part of the Bushman's daily scene. And so on, from the far south across the fertile valleys of Good Hope, through the mountain passes, up, up, up into the interior of this wide country, all this was once Bushman land. In fact, this very area in its winter coat was so much the Bushman's that it's called Bushman land to this day. Where these tents stand, the Bushman was once a lord in his own right. These tents belong to a nomad people called Hottentots, and they are one branch of the invasion which drove the Bushman out of his country. This woman, this child, this cat, reckoned in Bushman time, are newcomers in this ancient land. Now you can go on in this way for 1,500 miles, due north, until you arrive among the Matopo Hills, without setting foot for 1 minute on anything that wasn't old Bushman land. Here you are, in the heart of what was for hundreds of years a great Bushman fortress. Here for centuries the Bushmen fought back against the invaders. And I find it ironical that the grave of one of the leaders of the victorious invasion, the grave of Cecil John Rhodes, is in its midst. The African guarding the grave is of the Matabele, who conquered the Bushmen, until he too was conquered by Rhodes in his turn. Hard by Rhodes's monument, there is another monument left behind by the Bushman to himself. You climb up the smooth slabs of rock to a cave 600 feet above the surrounding land. We ourselves find the few monuments of this kind left so precious that we protect them with barbed wire against the modern sightseeing vandal. And there you have everything that was dear to the Bushmen. Water in the valley, a roof against the wind and weather, and smooth rock to paint on. No one knows quite how old these paintings are, and a moderate estimate puts them at 1,000 years. But faded as they are, you see distinctly a rhino, a giraffe, and other animals here. Compare these silhouettes with real animals who still stalk freely about in the vicinity. This young elephant bull, wondering whether he should charge us or not, was one of a herd of close on 1,000. This lion, going unperturbed through the bush, has been protected, but the Bushman has had no protection. And here too, in this far north, you meet again old friends of the Bushmen, great herds of the gnu, and once more the lordly eland. The eland is bigger here than in the far south, and look for the first time now with what immense gusto and precision the Bushman artist has painted a hunt of the eland. If you look closely here, you'll see a little Bushman hunter, his legs stretched out like an Olympic runner, closing in on an eland for the kill. Hard on this, you have a foretaste of how the Bushman saw the tall black invaders from the north before they provoked his animosity. Other scenes from his daily routine follow. A woman carrying a bundle of tubers on her head. A woman coming up to a friend resting in the shade with a gesture of affection. Another foreign giant, and a little Bushman standing gallantly up to him. A general scene in a Bushman encampment. A woman feeding her child. And then there's a Bushman hunter lying on his back, resting in the heat of the day, and others sitting around talking. Then a hunting scene, the hunter stooping to pick up his kill, and a frieze of men and women on the march, and once more a general scene round about a temporary camp. These scenes exhaust the selection in this particular cave, but in other caves nearby there are other samples of which these are representative. Here, for instance, is a Bushman's idea of an ostrich hunt. You can see a Bushman disguised as an ostrich creeping up on the right-hand side of the picture. Then there's a Bushman hunter setting out for the chase, surveying a tortoise, 2 ant bears, a litter of little ant bears, the inevitable gnu, and below the gnu, a magical python. There is also a herd of eland, done in the great period of eland painting, showing the herd pursued by a pride of lion, and one lion pouncing on the back of an eland. And last of all, there is the Bushman in a tender mood. You cannot fail to see the affection with which he has painted this conversation piece of an eland father and mother and their child. Now, I used to go all over South Africa looking at these rock paintings, and I never looked at them without this old, old sense of guilt being revived, because seeing the painting made me think of another story of my grandfather's. My grandfather told me that he took part in the raid which killed off the last of the Bushman painters in southern Africa. He was a very young man then, and they caught up with the Bushmen, and this painter was trying to escape on a horse. It's extraordinary how quickly the Bushmen learned to ride the horses of the invaders, and how well they rode them. And when this poor man was shot down, and my grandfather came up to the man's body, lying in the veldt, they found he had a zebra thong round his middle, and attached to this thong were a dozen little pots, and each pot contained a paint of different color. And that, alas, was the end of the last of this 1,000 and 1,000 years old school of painting in southern Africa. Now, there's one thing about Bushman painting which is rather remarkable. The Bushman who painted animals so well doesn't really give us an idea of what he himself looked like. And the trouble was that the Bushman was extraordinarily sensitive about his size. He was rather a small chap. He wasn't a pygmy. He was about 5 feet in height, as far as we can gather. But he felt that in comparison with this immense invasion that came from the north, that he was really a tiny little man. And as a result, he intended to exaggerate his own size in his painting. And it's rather an art telling when the giant in the painting is not just a Bushman and when he's a foreigner. In fact, the Bushman was so obsessed with this question of size that he'd like you to look upon him as a big chap, and the polite form of Bushman greeting, the way they greeted one another when they met, was to say, "Kaise kunkrenka," which meant, "I saw you looming up from afar, and I'm dying of hunger." Now, I'm going to show you in a minute or two how the Bushmen looked to my ancestors. But before I do that, I want you to know, to realize what he truly looked like. And what he looked like on my grandfather's farm, because I had two authentic models always in front of my eyes. These two little Bushman children who survived my grandfather's raid. Now, they were perfectly shaped little men. Again, I emphasize they're not pygmies. They were about 5 feet in height and perfectly made. They had small feet, small hands, ankles like race horses. But their little bodies were Cupid-shaped. They were well out in front and well out behind. And they had lovely peach-colored skins and deep, deep brown eyes with a wonderful slant to them, the same sort of slant you see in Mongol or Chinese eyes. And then they had a very loose, wrinkled skin. It was lovely to see them laugh, because this skin broke into 1,000 sort of cheerful little creases of all kinds. Now, when these little Bushmen died, and I thought that they'd gone forever, I used to go with my family to Cape Town, to the Cape of Good Hope. And I was taken to the museum there, and I was shown Bushmen behind the glass case in the museum. These were models made of live Bushmen who lived about 70 years ago. But they were models made of Bushmen in a decadent period, a few survivors who had already been corrupted by the fat of civilization. Now, I would ask you, please, to remember that when you see them in these plaster casts in the museum in Cape Town, because, in fact, they were not really like that at their best. And also, please remember that the man who modeled them, the man who made these casts, typically had a rather disdainful attitude towards them. And what you are going to see now, in a sense, is a caricature. Here are some Bushman women with fat behinds when food was plentiful. They are followed by a group of Bushman hunters examining the spoor of an animal, and a hunter with a kill in his hand. There is an old lady making beads out of broken ostrich eggshells, and a Bushman housewife by her pot, the only utensil the Bushmen had. Then please look at the pointed pan-like ears of this Bushman woman sitting here. Then there's an old lady sleeping on the ground, and a group of young women singing for a dance. Here, then, you have the final tragic irony. The Bushman survives in the Union of South Africa today only in the shape of these models behind glass in a museum. Now, you may wonder, as I do, when and where exactly this process of elimination began. Well, it seems to have been something that's been going on for close on 40,000 years. You'll remember that we left the Bushmen last time, driven out of the Mediterranean world, and driven well south of the Sahara and the plains of Upper Egypt. But in the southern half of the Africa, the Bushman maintained himself effectively for about 30,000 years. He didn't start getting seriously into trouble until the Arabs and other Orientals discovered what an extremely valuable source of supply for slaves Africa was. When that happened, the Arabs started raiding into the interior. And as they raided into the interior, the black Bantu races fled south. And as they fled south, being better armed than the Bushmen, with spears and shields and assegais, they drove the poor little Bushmen in front of them, fleeing south from one waterhole to the other. Unfortunately for the Bushman, when this process was absolutely at its most critical phase in the north, he was unfairly taken in the back. For about 300 years ago, my ancestors, the Dutch, landed at the Cape of Good Hope. And they'd not been at the Cape of Good Hope long when they found the Cape Peninsula much too small for them, and they started pushing north. And as they pushed north, they drove the Bushmen in front of them. And again, being better armed, they had it all their way. And they went on in this manner until suddenly the two waves of invasion, the European from the south and the African from the north, met. And in the process, the Bushmen were squashed flat. And the only ones who remained were a few pathetic fragments who fled to the Kalahari desert. Now, the impact of this invasion is clearly shown in Bushman painting. At first, the Bushman painter was completely objective about the event. Now, here, for instance, is a Bushman painting of the invaders as he saw them. Now, here is another painting where the Bushman is still feeling sufficiently unthreatened to make fun of the black giants, but not for long, because more and more you begin to see this sort of painting, a painting of a battlefield with the dead scattered on the rocks and arrows flying thick and fast through the air. That is how it looked to the Bushman artist. We will now see how it appeared to the European historian. Here is a reconstruction of the black invasion from the north made for a historical occasion in South Africa recently. When that invasion started, everywhere the Bushman looked, he saw these giants pouring in onto him, and day and night the silence and the age-old peace around him were shattered by the sound of war drums and battle cries. Hard pushed in this manner in the north, the Bushman was about to be stabbed in the back. My ancestors landed at the Cape of Good Hope, looking oddly out of place and refined as they did so. Soon they found the Cape too small for them and started moving into the interior. Rifles in hand and singing their battle hymns, they too drove the Bushmen before them. Then inevitably, the two tides of invasion met. scene such as this, my great-grandparents were massacred, and only their daughters survived. When it was over, the Bushmen too had vanished from the scene into the great thirst land of southern Africa, the Kalahari. Now I've told you of this pledge, of this pact I made with myself when I was a child. Well, many years went by, and although I never forgot my pledge, I never got the chance to carry it out. But I was reminded of it in a manner very soon after the war, in a manner which I couldn't possibly ignore. I was sent by the British government on a mission to explore the Kalahari Desert. Now this is the Kalahari Desert. Would you please come and look at it a little more closely with me? Now this area here, the Kalahari Desert, is one of the great unknown quantities of Africa. That is, we know where it is, but we know very little about it. And I was sent by the British government to make a systematic exploration of the Kalahari Desert. And I can remember the relevant occasion extremely well. I remember coming one evening in the central Kalahari Desert here to a pan. Now, pan is an Afrikaans name for a dried-up depression in the Kalahari Desert. And I remember the sun was going down, and in this kind of rosy red light of the desert, we saw some human footprints in the dried-up clay. When I saw those footprints, I thought I felt exactly what Robinson Crusoe must have felt like when he saw the footprints of man Friday in the sands of his island. And all those people who were with me looked at the footprints, and they were all convinced that footprints so small, so far from water, could only have been made by the genuine Bushmen. And those footprints became part of my conscience. They reminded me, in a way in which I couldn't ignore, of the fact that I had a 40-year-old pledge to fulfill. They reminded me of this pact I'd made in my childhood with the Bushmen. So when last year I got the opportunity, with the help of the BBC, of going to the Kalahari, I felt I just had to go. And next time I hope to take you with me on this journey, in search of a lost Bushman world, and to show you the people and the animals we met by the wayside. I hope to tell you of the spirits of the slippery hills, and to tell you of many other things, and show you many other places, until we made our final contact in the central desert at last.